we're moving on to the next session of the conference. For about the next half hour, we're going to focus on the experience of those working at a local level to address child poverty on the ground. And the aim of this session is to get their direct input from those leading that work to tackle child poverty. And I'll be asking the leads about the progress they've made, the challenges they face, and what we all need to do to bring about a step change in our work in addressing child poverty in Scotland. Contributing to today's discussion will be Annabel Armstrong-Walter from Renfrewshire Council, Annette Johnson from Aberdeenshire Council, and Sally Buchanan from Falkirk Council. So thanks very much for volunteering to do this. I'll start with a question to each of you, maybe starting with Sally, reverse order. What progress do you think you've made locally in tackling child poverty over the past 2 or 3 years? And where do you feel there's been real improvement?
Thanks for that, Bill, and thanks for the introduction. Like many of the speakers today, I'm also full of the cold, so you'll all be glad that this is online and not in person, as I would risk spreading it to everyone. So hopefully my voice will hold up and you can hear me okay. So I think for us locally in Falkirk, the biggest key over the last few years has been a growing awareness and understanding of child poverty, particularly amongst our senior leadership within the council, across our community planning partnership, and for our elected members. And I think this understanding of it then enables us to target additional resources to support children and families, and particularly our child poverty priority groups. So here at Falkirk, in recent years, we've expanded our free school meal entitlement. So we actually support additional low-income households or kids from low-income households who are not entitled under the national scheme. We've been doing that now for the past couple of years, and actually that has then led them to receive further additional support throughout the COVID pandemic. A significant proportion of the funding that was received to support people affected by the pandemic was directed towards supporting families with children and young people, and again with a focus on those priority groups. And all those decisions were, I guess, reasonably easily accepted by senior leadership, by elected members, because they had that understanding of the need to make sure that we are supporting children and families. And a kind of slightly unrelated example, but one that I'm quite proud of within Falkirk. Falkirk Council allocated 3 million of funding to support capital projects that is to be allocated via a community choices participatory approach, with public being able to put forward and community groups putting forward projects and a public vote on how that would be spent. That's 3 million funding, half over this year and then the other half next year. But instead of simply allocating that funding across our 9 wards equally, we managed to get approval to allocate that funding against the number of children who are in poverty within each ward. That means every ward gets some funding, but those with the greatest number of children in poverty receive the greatest investment within their communities. And again, I think we managed to get that through because of the kind of understanding that our leaders have in terms of child poverty. And I think that comes down to these child poverty reports and the work that we have done to develop that awareness and understanding.
Thanks very much, Sally. Annette.
Trying to unmute myself there. I think the focus on child poverty has helped develop a really strong partnership approach. It's raised awareness that it's not just down to the local council. It is a priority for our community planning partners as well. So one thing that we've done in Aberdeenshire is to make sure that not only are everybody aware of child poverty and it's their job to help us reduce that, but to look at pathways for people to link in and get that support when they need it. So by working together, we have streamlined referral pathways. We in Aberdeenshire, from the very start of developing our action plans and our reports, have been able to engage with those with lived experience, which has been really positive, really helpful, especially during the pandemic, where people were really unsure on where to get the support, and partners had to change very, very quickly in their delivery models. So we were really lucky that we had lived experience that we could go to and ask them, how do we then shape the services going forward? And they helped us shape a cash first approach to free school meals, made sure that our communication was more effective and targeting at those that needed most help. So I think the most improvement that's been made in Aberdeenshire is just that awareness, and the fact that at every level, whether it's the council or NHS or some of our third sector partners, or whoever the partner is, there is a commitment to reduce child poverty in Aberdeenshire, and we're all working together, and that strength in partnership actually shows with the outcomes that we've had over the last few years.
Thanks very much, Annette. Annabelle.
Hi, everyone. It's always difficult going third in a line, isn't it?
Always hard. I'll start you with the next thing.
I think there was a couple of things I just wanted to say. I guess one was, Renfrewshire have had quite a heavy strategic focus around child poverty for a while. I think in terms of what's happened since the Act and the LCPAR duty is that increased focus specifically around families and understanding how we're targeting families locally, but also priority groups as well. And I guess in terms of Renfrewshire's specific work, over the last kind of year and a half, we've been starting to develop our social renewal work, to kind of map out, I guess, some of the response to COVID. And it's been good to see poverty and income being right at the heart of that strategic planning again. And I think that aligned with the widening inequalities that we know exist for particular groups, plus that priority group focus within the Act, I think will allow us, particularly over the next years, to really hone in on some of those groups and some of those distinct disadvantages. So that was just the kind of two things that I think have come together quite nicely, even though they're kind of technically unattached.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Annabelle. All three of you have touched on the pandemic and how it's affected your work. Are there any learning points you've taken away from the pandemic about future work, the way you work locally? I'll start with you at this time, Annabelle. Yeah.
Thanks. I imagine we're all going to say that the pandemic perhaps altered the nature of some of our partnership working locally, and I think that's been a major piece of learning across, almost anyone that I've spoken to. Some of that was specific to do with the conditions of the pandemic in terms of the need to respond very quickly, and perhaps a lack of bureaucracy and that kind of focused common goal, which enabled us to do some of that. But there's so much learning in there for how we work both directly with communities in the third sector moving forward. So I think that's been a big bit of learning in terms of pulling in the same direction. I guess the other thing I would say about the pandemic quite specifically is that the sheer pace and volume of the work has just been wild, I think, really, and it's relentless. And I think for a lot of us, particularly in roles like ours, we might find that although people are using terms like post-pandemic, we're absolutely nowhere near post-pandemic in the reality of what communities are experiencing. So I think we are still balancing a need for, almost that emergency response still, and that very kind of acute response piece, as well as trying to plan in the longer term around child poverty, while we still don't know what the current picture is. So I think that balance, both in terms of capacity and planning, is a major challenge that's been brought about by the pandemic. So
yeah. Thanks, Annabelle. Annette.
I think the strength in partnership actually helped us through the pandemic, and as Annabelle said, things had to change really, really quickly. But probably the thing that we learned the most was not how we could all respond quickly, but how some of our targeted communities or our marginalised communities were affected most. And I think the inequalities for some of those client groups increased, and we missed that. So I think in Aberdeenshire, what we want to do is make sure that we never miss that again. For instance, we had engaged with our Gypsy travelling community, and during lockdown, they didn't have access to running water because we had closed down all the public toilets. So I think our lesson is to make sure that those that are most marginalised are front and centre of any developments or any policy or services going forward, and that we need to hear the voice of everybody, and we shouldn't do any more harm. And that goes with parents with children with complex needs, or parents that have got a disability as well. I think we need to reflect our actions within our action plan and strategies so that they can recognise themselves in that. And that was a huge learning for us, because we were very quickly getting food to people, very quickly doing the cash first approach, because we're a rural area, so putting money in people's bank accounts. And it wasn't until we stopped and took a breath in the middle of the pandemic that we realised actually some of those that we're trying to work with are further away than what they were before the pandemic. So that was a huge learning for us.
Thanks very much, Annette. I think that's a really, really important piece of learning. Certainly in my other role, I work for a disabled people's organisation, and that was a very strong message that came to us, that some people were even further excluded. Sally.
Yeah, thank you. And I get the shot of going last this time, which is fair enough. And I guess echoing what some of the others have said, but I think for Falkirk, I think there's now a much better acceptance and recognition, again, from senior leadership and elected members about the contribution that our communities can actually pay and deliver, and actually what they can bring to the table. And that's really kind of helped, I think, for us. It's helping us to change that relationship with our communities. I think the fact that, none of us could have responded without the community organisations on the ground, and that whilst, many of us were working remotely, we were working from home, it was our, community volunteers that were out there on the streets delivering food to people. And I think that actually has really, really helped, people to recognise the value and the key role that they play. I think, as Annabelle says, that whole bit about where you're pulling in the same direction, when we've got a common goal, it's really easy to focus on that and come together. And, the common goal was so obvious at the start of the pandemic. It was about making sure people had food, they had medicines, they had what they needed. We established a community coordination group very early on in the pandemic. And if I'm honest, I'm not even sure who established it or how it came about, but it was a kind of like-minded group of individuals that came together at 4 o'clock each day and really just kind of focused on what needed to be done and what did our community groups actually need to support people. So that group had, our third sector interface, it had voluntary groups, health and social care, NHS, and quite a few of the council services. And, throughout the last 18 months, that group has looked at, purchasing food collectively, volunteer expenses fund, where do we get hold of hand sanitizer, PPE, food hygiene training, mental wellbeing support for volunteers. The list goes on and on of the things that group have done. It's no longer meeting daily, but it's still meeting weekly, and it is really, really focused on taking forward positive change. And I think it, again, that group just shows the value of what we can do when we come together with a common goal and the absolute essential contribution that our communities bring to the table.
Thanks very much, Sally. One of the questions popped up in chat about how do we empower everyone to do what they can, and it's linked to, I think, a follow-up question I wanted to ask, which was, there was some relaxation, let's say, of the way that we normally do things during the course of the pandemic. Is that still there, do you think? Because I visited projects, other members of the Commission visited local action to tackle some of the problems that were caused by the pandemic. And we were really, really impressed with the way that local authorities had given the structure, let's say, to allow local groups to do that work because they were doing it most effectively. Monetary support was really important, obviously. But do you think that's still there, that sort of the trust that was engendered by the work that was done during the pandemic, and that relaxation of the way that you normally do things. And I know it's a difficult one because it is public money, but do you think it's still there? I'll start with Annette this time just to make it fair.
Yeah. I think the red tape was disappeared during the pandemic, and rightly so, because we had to respond to the needs that were coming. I think some of that trust and those relationships that's been built with our communities, with those that have got lived experience, I think some of that is growing. But I work for a local authority and it is public money. So I think some of that red tape is creeping back in, because we have to be accountable for the funds that go out. But I think the difference now is, although we have some of that red tape coming back, the difference is we have that relationship with our communities and our third sector and our local people that we can make sure they understand the responsibility that they have with the public money and how we can work with them to access the resources that they need. So although we might have some red tape that's coming back, well, we do have some red tape that's coming back in, I think we're in a different position with that relationship building. So.
Great. Annabelle?
I think it's a mixed picture. So I think what I can see is, I guess, doing that really early doors strategic planning alongside community groups and partners feels easier now. It feels like, you know, that's built, I guess, that kind of mutual trust in that respect. So I'm seeing some kind of more interesting bits of partnership planning work coming through. In terms of the money, I think what's interesting is that perhaps a lot of the flexibility that local authorities had in terms of funds, maybe because there was a flood of extra funding that came through at the beginning of the pandemic, which had, you know, depending on what it was, varying amounts of restriction around how it could and couldn't be deployed within communities. So I think within that context, there were extra resources that could be distributed in that kind of lower risk way. I think now we're back perhaps to looking at mainline budgets that are pushed and under pressure, and where there's a balance for mainline service delivery. I think we're probably are more constrained around some of the kind of red tape and processes in that respect. So I do think some of that freedom around financial resources was specifically because there was enough there, whereas now we're probably back now in a deficit position.
Yeah. Sally, anything to add on this?
Yeah, just to say, I think perhaps, again, with the awareness of what our communities can bring to the table, I think there is a greater acceptance that actually they've got a role to play, and actually by funding them and allowing them to get on with that, you know, that's really valuable. I think the red tape is probably, you know, is creeping back in internally, as the others have said, but I guess that understanding helps at least me to argue back against it at times. So we recently underwent an audit of our food fund, our holiday food fund, and you know, our audit wanted us to put more asks on our community organisations as part of their applications to do a lot about justifying why this funding was needed, and why did people need funding to feed kids over the summer holidays. And I argued back and said, no, we know they do. That's why we've allocated the funding. You know, we shouldn't actually need to ask our community organisations to justify that this is needed. We already know that. We've put funding there. Let's keep, you know, this is small amounts of money. Let's keep the ask on the community organisations, who are often volunteers, to as little as possible. They need to show us what they're going to do with that money, how they will target it, what they will spend it on, how they will make sure the right people are benefiting. But we shouldn't take it right back to the start and ask them to justify, you know, why do people need this in the first place? Because we already know that. Great,
thank you. I mean, just on the resources side of things, I did notice that the cut to universal credit has gone ahead, as far as I'm aware, but the UK government did announce this week that £500 million would be made available to local authorities in England to deal with higher energy costs and food poverty. So using the Barnett formula, and about 50 million will come to Scotland. which will become part of the block grant. So it doesn't necessarily need to be used for those purposes. But if I was in local government, I would be arguing strongly with national government that it should become part of the kitty that's available to tackle poverty at a local level. So that's maybe a wee bit of reassurance that maybe some extra resources will be coming down to you. Not enough, but some. What challenges do you think you face going forward? And I'll start with Sally again this time.
Yeah, and I think you've just touched on one of them. I mean, lack of budget is the easy answer to that. And I think, again, the pandemic demonstrated what we could do when we had additional money, when we had money that was directed at supporting people, and we had a kind of requirement to get that out. But aside from budgets, I think for us locally, I want to make sure that we're getting the right balance between the kind of reporting and the actual doing. So, as the lead for the Child Poverty Action Reports, we have spent a lot of time and effort recently on reporting, and that's great. We've got our annual plans in place. We're back on track after the pandemic. But where it's really interesting, where it's really valuable is the doing, and that's what makes a genuine difference. So I think, we need to make sure that we've got that balance right, and that we're not spending too much time doing the planning and reporting and actually failing to get on and make the difference that this work really, really should. I think just on budgets briefly, one of the other things that we learned through the pandemic and reported in our Child Poverty Action Report as a case study was the value in funding that's a bit more discretionary. So we've got Scottish Welfare Fund and people can come and apply for it, and it is quite a convoluted process. One of our community organisations got some additional funding during the pandemic that allowed them to actually go out and proactively offer people funding. And it was, I mean, we're talking like a £30 shopping voucher. It wasn't a huge amount of money, but they phoned up some of the, families they were aware of. And actually through those phone calls discovered that these families were sat there, they hadn't approached them for help, but some of them were sat with no milk in the fridge. They were sat there with nothing. They were saying, thank you so much for this. This means I can actually get some, fruit for this week's, food. And I think that there's an interesting bit there about that discretionary funding and being able to actually go out and offer that. And by offering that, you can then tease out perhaps a bit more about their situation and how you might help them to then kind of, get out of those circumstances potentially, or link into other services. So I don't know how we do it, but there's a bit in there about the value of that small amount of money and offering it and being able to reach out to people with it.
Yeah. Annabelle, big challenges?
I think a lot of I don't know whether things have changed or whether the pandemic has exposed perhaps some of the assumptions we made about how or why people access services. And I think we need to start from scratch in a lot of ways around thinking about what it is people want from services. And I'm thinking about things like local employability services or advice. Prior to the pandemic, we would have had a number of assumptions about how people want to access face-to-face advice, where they want to access it, so on and so forth. I think we need to re-examine a lot of that. And I think that's where this kind of increased focus around how we involve people and how we involve lived experience is absolutely key, because I think we possibly need to accept that some of our assumptions about how we do things may now be incorrect. Whether that's because we were ever right about them or they've changed, I don't know. And the only way that we're going to get that is by talking to people directly about where they find themselves at the moment. So I think that's the challenge, is that we need to scrap some of those assumptions and start from the beginning again in terms of thinking about what it is local people need to be able to be okay and live a good life.
Yeah, I think that's the most important thing about involving people with lived experience, is they can tell you whether those assumptions are correct or not for them, and often they're not, just as you say. And Annette, what's the big challenge for yourself going forward?
I think the big challenge for ourselves is to use what we've got better, but also we have got an increase in people coming and asking for some support, whether that's employability, financial inclusion support, because we have been hit. We've got a huge increase in universal credit. We're a rural area, so we have all the challenges for people in that. The fuel increase, we already had households in fuel poverty, which is going to really hit hard with those who were experiencing it. We've got new people who are experiencing poverty. So I think it's our challenge is about how do we make sure that our service is and support is in place for everybody and that they can all access that at the time that they need it. We've really lucky in Aberdeenshire that Aberdeenshire Council has gave us additional funding this year for tackling poverty and inequalities because they can see what the stats are telling us. So a lot of that will be used for a flexible fund, whether that's food or a cash first approach to make sure that those that are just missing those crucial amounts for accessing benefits have got heating and they're not making that decision about do we put our heating on or do we feed our kids, because this is what people have been facing prior to the pandemic, and it's just made it worse. All the issues that we have that's in the news at the moment are really hitting our families quite hard. So it's about using what we've got a bit better, making sure that cash first approach is developed, and those families who are having a challenging time, some for the first time, have access to the support they need at that time.
Yeah. One of the things I regret about using this form rather than some of the other forms is you can't show likes in the chat function because there's a number of comments there that I'd definitely be liking at the moment. Just about the importance of involving local people. The next Scottish Government delivery plan will be announced next year. What would you like to see in it that would help your work locally? I'll start with Annabelle again.
So I guess there's a couple of things, and we touched on it, I think, you know, in the kind of earlier addresses around recognising the role and expertise of local government within that wider plan. And I think, you know, there really needs to be a recognition that we aren't, you know, while those core basic services are essential, we're actually also policy and strategy setters for local areas in our own right as well, in terms of economic policy, in terms of recovery, and in terms of so many things. So I think some of that recognition around local government's role is important, that does the kind of nuts and bolts, spins and services stuff, but also recognises our strategic influence locally in those partnerships, as well as obviously the kind of local accountability that we've talked about as well. And I think one of the examples around that is that the Act and the LCPAR are very focused around the drivers of poverty, which is great, and that's absolutely not to take away from that. But I feel at a local level there's a tension between, you know, focusing what we report on the drivers of poverty and actually all the other things that we're doing that aren't relevant to the drivers of poverty, and then not the step down, you know. So in Renfrewshire we've had a really long-term approach to educational attainment and the poverty-related attainment gap. We do lots which doesn't tackle the causes of poverty, but is real-life mitigation for people who are actually living in poverty in our areas. And I think sometimes that feels, within the current context, like some of that longer term work or some of that contextual work or even some of the community-based work, you know, if we talk about the Christie principles and how we want services to look and feel, some of that's not specifically around poverty drivers, but my goodness, is it absolutely at the core of tackling some of these issues. So I think we need to find a way somehow, and I don't know the answer, to be both focused around the drivers and what's going on, but also recognising the kind of breadth of local government's role and all the powers that we do have to, again, make people help them live good lives, essentially. So that's that.
Annette.
I'm really lucky because we do have local voices that tell us what they think. So we've already spoken to them about what they think should be in the next national strategy. And the things that are coming up from Aberdeenshire rural perspective is affordable housing. Now, everybody should be able to have affordable housing and they'd be able to heat it affordably, and that is a huge thing for us. So anything at a national level that's going to help is really good. We've heard from a number of speakers today about the support for lone parents or those with care and responsibilities going into employment and accessing that, which can be really difficult if you don't have flexible childcare. It shouldn't just be for preschool. It needs to be all ages, especially if you've got a child with complex needs. And I don't think that's necessarily taken into account in what we have. But probably what's coming through very strongly is that action plan had been written prior to the economic challenges that we're facing, and it needs to be sustainable long-term goals rather than short-term, and that goes with funding and resources as well. We can't resolve things with a year or 2 years funding, and we can't have flavour of the month either. We need to have more sustainability around the resources, and if we're really wanting to reduce child poverty and be serious about this, it's a long-term thing that we need to look at. So that's what should be reflected in any strategy. And I do agree with Annabelle, being able to have that partnership with local areas and those that are affected with poverty and inequalities, that should be key to anything going forward.
Yeah. Sally.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree about the funding bit. And there's a couple of different angles there. So, the challenges that local authorities have with budgets, we can get child poverty on the agenda. We can get it, folk to understand why we need to do this stuff. We can get great feedback about our child poverty action report. And then we'll get round to budget setting, and I'll still have to have the arguments about why we shouldn't make cuts to our welfare benefits service and our debt advice. And they're not statutory services. So, they will every year go up there as, why don't we just cut this? Why don't we just cut that? And that's a challenge. And our community organisations, our citizens advice bureaus, for example, will tell us every year that the 1 year funding just is impossible for them to really kind of long-term plan. And I get that, but I can't offer them any more certainty than a 1 year agreement. And we will every year end up having those same fights to make sure that their funding is at least maintained at the same level it was the previous year. So anything that can be done about longer term funding for this would be good. And the other bit that and I get the comments about flavour of the month, and I was reflecting on that as we went. But I do think that we've been asked to do child poverty action reports, and we put in place our local strategies. There isn't an opportunity to then get additional little bits of funding, to trial things, to test things. A little change fund that doesn't actually need to be a lot of money, but would let us trial something and show that it works locally, show the impact it could have, and then we would be able to then try and argue the case of why it would be a sensible thing to do locally and it would save money. But we can come together as a partnership around these with the NHS, with the community organisations, and go, actually, we should be trying to address this, and that would be really, really good. And we go, but nobody's got any resources or any additional money to actually do any of that. So some type of a change fund that local authorities can actually access around the child poverty action reports, I think would be extremely valuable.
Well, thanks very much for those thoughts. Really, really valuable. And I was listening. And the Commission is considering its advice to Scottish Government just now. And believe me, I will take on board what you've said. Thanks very much to all three of you, to Annabelle, to Annette, to Sally, for your contributions.